I'm now going to begin this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee in our first evidence session into the financing of the Scottish Government. We have 3 witnesses with us today, so welcome to you all, whether you're here in person or remotely. It's good to have you here, and we're looking forward to having a conversation with you this morning. We will all want to ask you questions, but we will try and do it in a fairly orderly fashion. But if I could just ask if all questions and all answers are directed through the chair, it just helps to keep things on a formal basis. So we'll begin by perhaps asking the 3 witnesses if they would just give us a very brief introduction to themselves and to the work that they do. That's the reason for them being here today. So I'll start with David Phillips, if I may.
Yes, good morning, Chair. My name is David Phillips. I'm an Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I lead our work on devolved and local government finance.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Claire Murdoch. I head up the fiscal sustainability and public funding work in the Scottish Fiscal Commission. We're the independent fiscal institution for Scotland, and the work I do looks at the overall Scottish budget in terms of the funding position. We do some work looking at spending both over the next 5 years, and we started looking at 50-year projections of the Scottish budget as well.
Okay, thank you. João?
My name is João Sousa, and I'm Deputy Director and Senior Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the Fraser Allander Institute at the University of Strathclyde, where I lead on work related to the fiscal position for the Scottish Government and the relations in terms of interactions between the UK and Scottish Government in terms of financing.
Okay, thank you all for that. Could I perhaps just ask if João's feed could be, if the volume could be, it won't go any higher, no? Okay, we'll just have to listen very carefully. You're a little bit quiet from this end, but thank you for that. I'll begin by just asking, it's often said that the Barnett formula is very useful insofar as it allows the pooling and sharing of risks and resources to make sure that funding for the Scottish Government is stable and secure. So how effectively do you think the Barnett formula does that? I'll start with David.
Yes, so I think it's true to say that because the Barnett formula allocates funding to Scotland, also Wales and Northern Ireland, not on the basis of what's raised there in terms of revenues, it basically, revenues are pooled at the UK level and then allocated via this formula. That does, if you like, pool and share risks related to revenue fluctuations. So if revenues are to go down in Scotland because there's a downturn, for example, in the oil and gas industry, and that affects, national insurance, corporation tax, the VAT receipts paid by oil companies and their workers. Well, because the funding for the Scottish Government by the Barnett formula doesn't depend on that revenues, that insulates, it pools and shares that risk. Yeah. But it's only sort of a partial sort of pooling and sharing of risk, if you like, as well, because the Barnett formula doesn't really account for the other side of the equation, not just what's happening to revenues, but what's happening to the spending needs of different parts of the country. It's a formula based on what was spent last year, and then a population share of the change in what's spent in England. But what if the Scottish population is ageing more quickly? What if the English population is growing more quickly? Those sorts of needs factors aren't accounted for. So whilst there's a degree of pooling and sharing on the revenue side, there isn't really via the formula pooling and sharing of risks on the spending side. And of course, with the changes with the fiscal framework, with more devolution of tax, we've started to see the Scottish Government exposed to a bit more risk on the tax side as well, of course, to give it the incentives on the tax side to grow the economy and the powers to vary the tax rates as well. So I'd say it does do something to pool and share risks, but if you like, it's a somewhat arbitrary formula that doesn't, effectively pool and share risks on the spending need side as well.
Do you think that would be as much of a concern given that there is now the ability to raise tax? Presumably that taxation can then be used to mitigate that risk.
So it depends on how you think about the role of the UK government in, if you like, pooling and sharing risks around the country. Of course, if you have powers to raise tax to allow you to raise more if your spending needs have gone up, that allows you to address the need to spend. But you might also believe that in a sharing union, that actually there should be a sharing of those risks across the UK as well. Now, that has been an issue that's been much more of an issue in Northern Ireland and Wales, where they felt that their spending needs weren't being reflected by the funding levels delivered by the formula. In Scotland, I might come on to this a bit later, the broad consensus is, if anything, the levels of funding are higher than the levels of relative needs in Scotland. So it's been much less of an issue in Scotland, sort of like keep our heads below the parapet type situation. But still, from first principles, if you think the union is about sharing not just risks on the revenue side, but also risks that affect spending needs like demographics, poverty, health, then you might say, let's look at this formula from a first principles basis.
And presumably then that assumes that everything that a devolved administration was doing policy-wise was absolutely to reflect those changing needs and not because of any, say, political priority.
I think what you would do is, rather than reflect actually what Scottish Government was spending, you wouldn't want to say what you're spending is your needs, because as you say, your spending reflects your choices on priorities. Maybe you want to be more generous on certain services and therefore raise taxes. Maybe you want to have lower taxes and therefore cut back services. So rather than base it on what is actually spent, a little bit like with local government in England, but also within Scotland, you'd want to devise a formula based on the demographic characteristics, the socioeconomic characteristics, that tries to estimate needs. And then, of course, the Scottish Government could then spend above that, below that, if it was to raise more or raise less itself through its own devolved powers. Yeah. And I think that is another kind of fact which makes needs-based funding, I guess, a little bit tricky in practice, is devising a formula that everyone can agree to can be a bit tricky.
Absolutely. João, I'll come to you next. Just the same question. Do you have any further reflections on it?
Thank you, Chair, and I hope you can hear me slightly better now. I think I agree with David's point generally that there is a pooling of risks to some extent. I think it is important to also consider the fact that the Barnett formula, the way that it is set out, it allocates spending to areas for which responsibilities are devolved, but it's also a way of kind of ensuring that the fiscal stance as a whole is propagated to devolved areas of the UK as well, because it depends on what the UK government decides is the appropriate amount of spending that will happen. And therefore, it ensures that, given that the fiscal stance is a reserved power from the Treasury, it ensures that that is then propagated in kind of an appropriate way, or in a way that is defined and can be predicted, but it also is a way that ensures that the decisions that are taken don't just affect England, they affect Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well, and kind of follow similar paths, even if the levels of spending might be slightly different and the additions to spending might be slightly different from population proportions. As David pointed out, there's differences in population growth that can and do affect the outcomes of the formula. In Scotland, we think that spending levels in all the needs assessments from 1979, from 1993, the Holden Commission in Wales in 2010, they all point to the relative need on a per person basis in Scotland being more than fulfilled by the level of spending that actually happens, which is not always the case for Wales and Northern Ireland, and has led to, in those countries and regions, there being a push for kind of a needs-based floor, whereas that would essentially not have any applicability in Scotland in the same way, because Scottish spending is already at a higher level than what we think any relative needs assessment would lead us to conclude. But there are a lot of difficulties in any assignment of spending on the basis of policy that is decided at a UK government department level, because ultimately the point of devolution is to allow for different choices and to allow for these decisions to be made somewhere else. And so you have to devise a formula in some way of compensating and making sure that the devolved administrations have the ability to plan for what they want to spend on and what their priorities will be. There were previous versions of the formula, and they all have benefits and drawbacks. None of them will be perfect, especially if we want them to be simple. This Barnett formula is very simple, which is great because it means that it is very predictable, easy to calculate, and it depends on a few parameters. But the drawback is that it can't take into account all the different, very granular changes in things like population density and things like that might mean that, for example, it's more expensive to deliver some services in Scotland than it would be somewhere else that's less rural.
Thank you. Claire, would you like to add anything to that?
Thank you. So the Scottish Fiscal Commission is obviously politically neutral, so there's certain things where we wouldn't make any comment on what formula should be used or could be used, but I think it's probably worth pointing out that the Barnett formula is still very important in determining the size of the Scottish budget. Even with tax and social security devolution, it's still the sort of biggest component. It's then complicated by the fact that you have had tax and social security devolution where you have block grant adjustments, which further depend on decisions the UK government is making on tax and social security. You then have borrowing powers, you then have some additional flexibilities. And so really, although the Barnett formula and the way it's calculated is providing the government with certainty on some aspects of its funding, the Scottish budget's also become a lot more variable over time and a lot more challenging for the government to manage.
Why would that be?
The Barnett formula and the block grant, which comes from the UK government, it can vary as the UK government changes their spending decisions. But the budget then also has the additions for tax devolution. So if income tax revenues go up, the Scottish budget has more. If it goes down, it has less. Then the UK income tax revenues affect the block grant adjustments. So you've got that side of the equation. And then we have this complicated process whereby we forecast Scottish tax revenues, the OBR forecast UK tax revenues, which are used to calculate the block grant adjustments. When we get the outturn data, there's then an adjustment that's made to the budget called a reconciliation, so that's variable as well. So you've just got a lot more of these components. You're seeing similar things on the social security side as well. Yeah. So all these different, instead of having effective kind of one moving piece, you had pre-fiscal devolution with the block grant. Yeah. You now have several moving pieces which are all going up and down and just need to be monitored. So it's still very important, but there's just other factors at play as well in how the budget's determined.
That's great, thank you. I've got some supplementaries here. Kirsten first then.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think this would be probably a question for João and David. So until we're at the point of convergence, which I suspect we might come to later on this morning, would you say that the Barnett formula is working to the benefit of the Scottish people insofar as it allows for higher levels of public spending?
Let me come on there first, Chair. So in terms of the formula itself, I think we should remember the formula itself just affects the changes in spending. So in essence, the changes in spending are what are driving that convergence process that over time will slightly erode that higher level of spending in Scotland, at least if current projections for spending and population growth hold true. But the level of spending, that is definitely at the moment to the benefit of Scotland. As João said, there have been 3 or 4 assessments over the years of what the relative spending needs of Scotland would be compared to England. The most recent was undertaken by Jerry Holtham. It was mainly to look at the Welsh situation, but he did produce estimates for Scotland and Northern Ireland with some more sort of uncertainty about them. At that point in 2010, he estimated needs in Scotland around 5% higher than in England per person. At the moment, it's about 20 to 25% higher spending in Scotland as a result of the block grant. Now, things might have changed over the last 10, 15 years. I think, if anything, the methodology used by Jerry Holtham might understate what might be implied by, for example, how the Scottish government thinks about spending needs. In effect, his methodology looked at how spending was allocated within England. England doesn't really have many very rural and remote areas like Scotland, and the Scottish government, for example, allocates a lot of money towards those areas. So if you use the formula a bit more like the Scottish approach to sort of rurality and sparsity of population, you might not get 105%, you might get 110%. But I think it's clear that at the moment there's a good chunk of money, a few £billion a year, that the block grant is delivering on top of what an assessed spending needs would give to Scotland. The question is, in the longer term, will that sustain, or will it be eroded by convergence? And I guess, from a UK-wide perspective, there'll be consideration about, is that fair to other parts of the UK, like the north of England, for example?
If I can come on to that. So the Barnett formula, by putting in, by its nature, kind of, as David said, just takes the additions and calculates the share of Scottish additional expenditure, but essentially locks in the differences that were there to begin with, subject to any changes to over long periods of time to population growth and the fact that the additions are slightly smaller in percentage terms than they would be if you just took percentages of the additions. But essentially, what's driving the higher levels of spending in Scotland is the fact that once the formula was introduced, at the time when the formula was introduced, spending in Scotland was already higher than in England on a per person basis. And the formula doesn't do anything to make it lower than England. It might, at the edges, create some convergence, and there was some convergence until the early 1990s, and then mostly because population grew so much faster in England and continues to do so, then that convergence has kind of been eroded. But the formula itself kind of just locks in that. It's not the formula itself, it's kind of the decisions that are underlying the starting point that caused spending to be higher in Scotland. The only thing I would also like to add is that although spending is, about something like 20% higher on a per person basis in Scotland, the biggest difference is in capital. So it's slightly higher in day-to-day spending, but it's much higher in capital. And you might think that there are some good reasons why delivering capital investment to some, the levels of capital spending that might be needed to connect more rural communities, the fact that Scotland operates, for example, and the government does support, ferry services and things like that, is perhaps a perfectly good reason why you might expect capital spending to be higher in Scotland. But when you put it all together, perhaps the relative needs assessment would not produce as high a number as the formula does.
Douglas?
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Claire, following on from Claire's earlier evidence. The Scotland Acts of 2012 and 2016 provided greater responsibility over taxation and social security. For example, the block grant adjustment for 2025 to 26 is 5.6 billion, but forecasts from the Scottish Fiscal Commission is that spend is at 6.9 billion. The gap, therefore, is over 1.3 billion. Is the gap expected to grow in the future with recent Scottish Government announcements? And if so, where is this money found from? Is it found from other devolved budgets? And what fiscal risks does this bring?
There's some good questions in there. So we're talking about social security devolution. So there's several reasons why social security spending in Scotland is higher than the block grant adjustments. Those predominantly relate to policy decisions the Scottish Government has made. So the Government has decided to introduce new payments for which was no funding, so the Scottish Child Payment being an example of that. They've changed their approach to delivery, so they want more people to be able to access and find the application process easier for adult disability payment, child disability payment. That means we expect to see more people successfully applying. They've also got a more expansive approach to replacement payment, so the Sure Start maternity grant, for example, was replaced by the Best Start grant. There's more payments which are made at higher levels. And finally, there's mitigation of UK government policy, so decisions the Scottish Government have made on things like the bedroom tax, which is mitigated through discretionary housing payments, or the recent announcement about the 2-child limit and universal credit. So these are predominantly reasons that spending is higher on social security in Scotland. So you're completely right. We think the spending is going to be higher than the funding received from the UK government. We have thought in the past that would grow and our previous forecast had that growing quite significantly relative to the UK. Our most recent forecasts, and what matters here is what the OBR think is happening in the rest of the UK, don't see quite the same level of growth or divergence in spending, and that's predominantly because spending on disability payments in England and Wales is actually growing faster and thought to continue to grow faster in the future. So it's because of what's happening in England and Wales, where we're expecting spending to grow. That means the Scottish Government will receive more money through the block grant adjustments for social security, and that means that divergence in spending will not increase quite as much. But obviously, if social security spending in England and Wales doesn't increase on the disability payments as much as is expected, then that will potentially mean the Scottish Government has more of a gap to fill. I think your final question was about how they have to fill that gap. And basically, it has to be funded from elsewhere in the Scottish budget. So it represents a policy choice the Scottish Government is making to allocate more of its resources to social security spending, and that means they spend less on other things, or they can do that through raising taxes to fund that gap. So our most recent forecast, we think that by 29-30, the Scottish Government is going to be spending 14.9% of its budget on social security spending.
How much, sorry?
14.9% of its resource budget on social security spending. So that's a policy choice the government is making.
Cool.
David, did you want to come back in on that one? Could you do that briefly? Thanks.
The one thing very briefly I'd say is that, so in the current year, for example, I think income tax, the net income tax position is forecast to be, not in the current year, 25-26, the next year, is forecast to be £1.2 billion. And I think the social security position is forecast to be about £1.4 billion, which suggests that, if you like, the additional income tax revenues raised are being more than spent, like, on social security benefits. So there's a sort of a little bit of a net squeeze then on the public service budgets.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Angus MacDonald.
Thank you. The Scottish Government has called for full fiscal autonomy. What does this like? How does this work? How does it work in practice? Claire, why don't you have a go at that one?
I might hand that over to my colleagues. We focus very much on the current arrangements, and we don't take a view on how the arrangements could work, but João or David might want to come in.
David?
Well, David, if you want to come in.
Yeah, so what full fiscal autonomy means is that effectively all taxes, as far as possible, would be devolved to the Scottish Government. Now, if Scotland remains in the UK, you might then still have, say, the tariffs imposed on external trade still being managed by the UK Government. But all taxes otherwise would be devolved to the Scottish Government, as would all spending, including all the benefits like the state pension that are currently reserved to Westminster. Now, again, there may be some elements of spending like defence and foreign affairs that are still pooled at the UK level, and the Scottish Government would pay, if you like, a fee to the UK Government to do those on its behalf. Now, what this would do is it would give the Scottish Government, at least in principle, more power to vary a much wider range of taxes, to potentially choose a different fiscal stance, because it now be responsible for borrowing itself, so it could choose perhaps to borrow more. But the kind of key question is, how much power would it have in practice? As it stands at the moment, the Scottish revenues raised, if you count all the revenues effectively raised in Scotland, including those that currently go to the UK Government, on a per-person basis, including oil and gas revenues, they're perhaps about the same as the average across the UK as a whole. Public spending, if you include everything, including that's currently done on behalf of Scotland by the UK Government, is about 12% higher. With full fiscal autonomy, that sort of fiscal transfer that currently exists would likely have to be removed, because Scotland's keeping all its revenues, it's responsible for all its spending. So in the absence of faster growth in revenues or a reduction in spending, that could open up a bit of a budget deficit for Scotland under full fiscal autonomy. So it'd be quite a big change from the current constitutional setup. It would be very much close to sort of an independence situation in terms of how the public finances are managed, most likely, except that there'd still be, some taxes, like external tariffs, and some spending, like defence, managed at UK level.
Oh.
I would say that we don't know exactly how it would work, because some of what David said regarding, as far as possible, is doing a bit of the heavy lifting there, because there's a lot of taxes that are organized on a UK-wide basis, and for which there is currently no way to split them apart without creating a whole new system. And we've seen that with the assignment of VAT revenues, which has never been taken forward. And to be fully taken forward under some sort of full fiscal autonomy would require actually, either agreeing to assigning VAT revenues, for example, which, there's lots of problems about variability and what even constitutes Scottish revenues, for example. But also, if you do create a separate system, then it would require thinking through what kind of input and output tax would have to be collected and where, and what kind of systems you'd have in place. Similarly, where do you assign, for example, profits within the UK? Do we need to have a full transfer pricing system within companies that operate both in Scotland and the rest of the UK? So there's a lot of things to solve there. Now, that's not to say that they're not solvable, but they require choices that might at some points be more or less palatable to different parts of the UK and Scottish government, depending on how they fall. And the variability in particular is a real concern, because the reason, or one of the main reasons why VAT assignment has not been taken forward, is because the variability in estimates is such that you might have to, for example, cut spending just because, your sample size says that, you can't be precise enough to estimate things properly, and you might have to cut spending just because your statisticians say that in this sample, the revenues have fallen by this much. And that's not a great position to be in. And it's not very easy to explain to the general public why they then cannot access service X, Y, or Z.
Okay, Susan Murray.
Thank you very much, Chair. We have begun to talk a lot about whether the Barnett formula benefits Scotland, but I'd like to ask whether you think the calculation of the Barnett formula is fair to Scotland, because of it being based on the population and doesn't take account of the population density or deprivation or these kind of things.
Should I go first?
Yes, sorry, I'll start with you.
Okay, so as I said, I think it's important to distinguish between the initial starting level of funding for the Scottish Government and then the operation of the Barnett formula. So, as discussed, because before the Barnett formula came in, Scotland was receiving a higher level of funding per person through long-standing arrangements that went back to the kind of late 1800s. I think it was a chancellor called Mr. Goshen. That meant that back in 1978, Scotland was getting around about 30 to 35% per person more, I think, than in the rest of the UK. Now, as João said, during the 1980s, because actually there was high inflation and there was quite high economic growth, quite strong growth in overall level of spending. And the operation of the Barnett formula means that when spending is going up a lot, you get a lot of convergence. And let me explain why. Because let's say you start with £100 per person in England and £130 per person in Scotland, 30% more. Let's say over the decade, spending doubles in England to £200. That's a £100 increase. If population grows the same, etc., a £100 increase to Scotland puts it to £230. 230 compared to 200 is not a 30% difference anymore, it's a 15% difference. So during the 1980s, there was this convergence in spending. But since then, as João said, there hasn't really been much convergence in spending. That means that at the moment, spending per person in Scotland is about 20% more to 25% more. Looking back at the needs assessments, that's probably a bit more than those would assess Scotland to need, relatively speaking, accounting for things like sparsity of population and so on. Although the weights you apply to that, there could, of course, be a lot of debate around that. But come back to the formula itself. I think the issue is, at the moment, if you start to say, well, let's look at changing the formula so it's not just a a pounds per head, a population-based increase, it tries to take account of, well, you start off with higher spending, therefore you need a bigger pounds per person increase to maintain the same percentage increase. I think the risk is the UK government to say, well, let's actually look at the level of spending as well. Let's open that can of worms as well. So I think that from the Scottish government's, kind of more self-interested position, it might be, well, let's look 10, 15 years down the line when perhaps there may have been a bit more convergence. Then does it make sense for us to kind of reopen this can of worms? In the short term, whilst the formula itself isn't that friendly to Scotland, the level of spending you're starting with is quite friendly to Scotland. So, from a Scottish perspective only, it might make sense to wait and see.
Thank you. João, have you got an opinion?
I was going to say that the Gaussian formula that was introduced in 1888, I believe, that David mentioned, was indeed named after a Chancellor of the Exchequer then, and the whole idea of that was to keep the level of spending, basically to freeze it as the differences in levels of spending. Barnett formula takes a different approach in which there is some convergence if everything grows at the same rate that is used in the calculation. I think the question to ask is whether the outcomes of the Barnett formula are fair or not, and then you can have a discussion as to whether the level of spending given by the starting level and then the operation of the Barnett formula yields what is needed for Scotland or not. And I think it would be unfair to look at the formula itself and just think, is the formula itself fair, without considering, as David said, the starting point. And then there can be different opinions and different weights that you attach to different things. And you can come to different conclusions on whether it is fair or not. But I think you'd have to take into account both the starting position and the operation of the formula.
Okay. Do you have an opinion on that, Claire?
I think the Commission would take a view on that.
Okay. So I suppose, from what I'm hearing, is it correct that adopting a needs-based element in the Barnett formula, as you've just said, is likely to not have the result that we would expect?
So I think it would depend on how that was operated. So if it was to operate as the needs-based elements in Wales and Northern Ireland are, that would be to the benefit of Scotland. What those needs-based elements do is they've not assessed the level of spending, if you like, for those countries. It's just tweaked how the Barnett formula operates for the changes. So because there was a concern in Wales and then latterly Northern Ireland that actually there had been quite a bit of convergence, particularly in Northern Ireland, in terms of the funding levels, it was going to fall below that needs level. They said, well, let's top up the increments you get through Barnett. So Wales now gets population plus 5%, Northern Ireland population plus 24%. That sort of slows down, or in Northern Ireland's case, probably stops and slightly reverses the convergence. Now, if Scotland was to negotiate and say, well, look, we think our needs are, say, 10% higher, we should get needs plus 10%, and the UK government was to agree to that, then that would be good for Scotland. But I think in Wales and Northern Ireland, the situation was such that there was a credible case to say that the level of spending was starting to potentially fall below that needs-based level, so the UK government felt that maybe there's a case to sort of change the formula to prevent it. In Scotland, given most of the evidence is that Scotland is some way above that needs level, try. But I think the UK government might be more reluctant to make that sort of change in Scotland's case. But that sort of change would benefit Scotland financially.
So would that be the sort of case where political decisions taken both sides of the border would make a difference? Because if the Scottish Government was to make the case for they need to have extra funding to cover the different services in social security in Scotland, then that would influence that kind of decision.
I mean, I'm not a politician, so I'm not sure the political argument to make, but I think if an argument was made around, will we need relatively more funding because of our needs and our sparsity of population and so, the UK government might say, well, look, you already get more funding, and compared to these needs assessments, perhaps, that gap's already big enough. I think perhaps a stronger case, if you wanted to make one, would be to say the mechanism on the Barnett formula itself is different now in Scotland than Wales and Northern Ireland, that is the point you should look at. As I said, it'd be a political negotiation. I'd be surprised if there was quite the same openness to making that change for Scotland, given the starting point in terms of the level of spending. But it's a political negotiation.
Right. Okay. João, are you wanting to come in on that at all? No. So, just to conclude, the introducing a needs-based element into the formula, do you think that would increase or decrease the amount of money coming to Scotland?
Introducing a needs-based top-up to the annual increments in the Barnett formula would increase the Scottish Government's funding. Moving towards a needs-based assessment of the level of funding for the Scottish Government, I think, would reduce the Scottish Government's funding. Thank you.
We're having a nodding head from João, so I think he's in agreement with that one. Thank you, João. Number 4, Maureen Burke, I think, is coming in.
Thank you. My question is to yourself, David. You've published research which suggests that spending per capita in Scotland relative to England will fall in the next 30 years. Could you briefly explain your findings on that?
Yes. So, as João and I have said, and Claire has said as well, that the Barnett formula, by its design, gives a population-based increment on top of the initial funding that the Scottish Government receives. So if England gets a £10 per head increase in funding, so does Scotland under the Barnett formula. If you start with a higher level of funding, a given cash increment is a smaller percentage increase. You start with £100 a head, a £10 increase is 10%. You start with £200 a head, it's 5% increase. So over time, that leads to a convergence in funding. Now, there are other factors that operate against that. The Barnett formula doesn't really account for the fact that Scotland's population is growing less quickly than England's, so that increment of funding needs to spread across fewer additional people. That slows down that convergence. So we did some modelling looking at different scenarios for inflation, for above-inflation growth in spending, and the given population projections from the ONS to look at what that might mean for the relative funding levels of Scotland compared to England. And the outside of the projections now, it's about 20 to 25% higher. Given reasonable forecasts for inflation spending growth and population projections, that might fall to maybe around 112 to 115% over the next 15 to 20 years. So still substantially above England's level, but not as much so now. Now, I think that's why I said that, the Haltham Commission said that it thought that the needs in Scotland were around 105% of England's level. 112 to 115 is still well above that. But if you thought actually Haltham's methodology was underweighting things like sparsity of population, the ill health concentrated in areas around Glasgow, for example, actually that should be more highly weighted, you might think that 112 to 115 is more like starting to approach that needs-based level. That might be the point where Scotland wants to start thinking about, do you want to open this issue up and move towards a needs-based formula? Of course, that's all from the Scottish Government's position. From a first principles, what's a good design? You'd be not doing it on such a sort of zero-sum basis, more sort of first principles basis.
My follow-up question, I think you might have touched on earlier, is, so how could a needs-based adjustment to the Barnett formula impact those projections?
So if you were to say, let's do a little bit like we got in Wales and Northern Ireland, let's give not just Scotland a population-based increment, as it does now, but say, like Wales, a population plus 5%, that would slow down that rate of convergence, and it would mean that rather than converging to, say, 112 to 115%, as it would under current population projections and so on, it would converge to a somewhat higher level, maybe, 118 or so, not crunched all the numbers. But yes, that would slow down and mean that it was convergence to a higher level. So the kind of question is, would the UK government be open to that sort of arrangement, which I guess is a political question for UK and Scottish government.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Kirsten Sullivan.
Thank you. I think you've answered my question, which was around outlining convergence, but I think we've heard a comprehensive explanation already this morning. But can I ask, probably João and David, and feel free yourself, Claire, if you've got thoughts on this, is convergence or the Barnett squeeze an intentional design feature of the formula?
Shall I come in first? So the idea behind the formula at its outset was to have some convergence, because the fact that the Gaussian formula kind of preserved those differences, plus the fact that there were top-ups on the Gaussian formula outcomes, meant that actually the gap was growing, and there was a question as to whether that was the right outcome or not. And there was a lot of discussion in the early 1980s about between the Welsh office and Scottish office, and also UK government departments, as to whether that was fair or not. But the idea is that there should be some convergence over time, but it's not a drastic level of convergence either. So it's not something that happens in 1 year and immediately you're just slashing things to be equivalized. But yes, if population growth is the same, then over time spending additions will mean that there will be convergence.
If I may come in there as well. So I think kind of a couple of points there. I think the first thing is, as João says, there was an intention for there to be some degree of convergence. I think it was also introduced as a bit of a stopgap measure at the time they were thinking about devolution to Scotland and Wales back in the late 1970s. Now, Joel Barnett, who it's named after, seemed to have quite mixed feelings about it. At one time he said he was, why do they, this is like an albatross around my neck, effectively, this formula named after me. Other times said he was very proud it had lasted so long. But it was never really, I think, expected to last this long. Now, in terms of the convergence, I think if you look back since the late 1970s, the absolute level of spending has probably increased about tenfold. So if there had been, the kind of Barnett formula working as was intended, population had grown at the same rate and so on, say there was a 30% increase in spending in Scotland at the start, 130 compared to 100 in England per person. Well, now it'd be 1,000 in England and 1,030 in Scotland. That 30% difference would have become a 3% difference, but it hasn't. It's become a 20 to 25% difference. And there's a couple of factors for that. Firstly, particularly before devolution, Scottish secretaries were actually quite canny at negotiating top-ups to the Barnett formula, formula bypass. And as João said, population growth has been a lot slower in Scotland than it has been in England over that period. And those two factors have slowed down that convergence. There was also some flaws in how the Barnett formula treated business rates in the 2010s, which also slowed that down as well. Going ahead, we'd expect there to be some convergence, like I said in my answer to a previous question, but not to converge to a 3% gap or a 0% gap over time, but given current projections, maybe a 12 to 15% gap.
If I can come in. So 2 years ago, we published a fiscal sustainability report, and we looked at the Scottish Government's budget over 50 years. So we projected what would happen to block grant funding, what would happen to tax revenues, the block grant adjustments, and also what would happen to the Scottish Government spending. We ran a couple of scenarios there where we based it on the population projections at the time. New population projections were published yesterday, so we're updating the estimates as I speak. But we looked at what would happen based on those previous population projections if you had faster or slower population growth in Scotland. And what we showed was that if you had lower population growth in Scotland, the block grant funding would grow slightly slower, but actually your spending growth would be a lot slower. So that was, if you're looking at the whole budget, not relative to the rest of the UK, but you're looking at the whole Scottish budget, that actually that slower population growth in Scotland could be beneficial to the Scottish budget. And conversely, if Scotland had higher population growth, you'd have slightly higher growth in the Barnett formula and the block grant funding, but you'd have much higher growth in spending in the Scottish budget, and it would actually be So you'd have a sort of more negative fiscal position going forward.
If I may very quickly, I mean, that's a slight sort of irony of the situation at the moment. Because of the way the Barnett formula doesn't account for differential population growth, you get more per person to spend when the population is growing less quickly. That is actually a challenge for sort of one of the arguments the Scottish Government makes about let's boost population growth to boost the economy. It will probably boost economic growth. It might ease skills shortages, but because the Barnett formula doesn't sort of give you more money when the population is growing up more quickly, at least not really, that isn't necessarily good for the public finances of Scotland.
Thank you. Lillian Jones.
Thank you. What are the different ways in which the Barnett formula could be formalised, including putting it on a statutory footing?
João?
Go to João first.
I'm happy to come in first. So, I mean, in some sense, it's up to the UK Parliament and to decide how to put it into statutory footing. It could, the same way that the Seal Convention was put into legislation, it could be added to as an amendment to primary legislation, or it could be part of some other revision to the constitutional settlement. I think, you know, there's a question as to whether that would be beneficial or not. And it, you know, it's I'm not qualified to say constitutionally whether that would be beneficial or not, but from kind of a user of the Constitution, if you will, I can't see that would make a huge amount of difference. The Seal Convention is in legislation, and it has been bypassed before with the get out clause of not normally, I think, is what the legislation says in terms of consent. You know, the UK has got an unwritten constitution in which tenets of the constitution that are held to be very much, you know, fundamental aren't written down. So the fact that it is or isn't written down doesn't make a huge amount of difference from our point of view. And because no parliament can bind its own successors, then even if it were in legislation, it could theoretically be repealed. So I can't see that would make a huge amount of difference.
I think I agree with most of that. I may say that I think that by putting it on a statutory footing, it might change the politics around it slightly. So João is right that at the moment, you know, not just the operation of the Barnett formula when it applies or not, but also its existence effectively is in the gift of the Treasury. Now it is in the fiscal framework agreements with the Scottish and I believe the other devolved governments that it exists, but those intergovernmental agreements I think are not sort of enforceable in court. But by putting it on a statutory basis, in principle at least, the operation or the bypass of it could be challenged in court and would require primary legislation. If, you know, depending on how it was written, that might change the kind of politics around it. But I would agree with João that actually, because of the operation of the UK sort of constitution, because, you know, parliaments can't bind their successors, because we don't have a written constitution, I think like the kind of finance constitution that Germany has, it would be mainly operating through how it changes the politics around the Barnett formula as opposed to actually putting any real legal constraints on a long-term basis for the government.
And I think regardless of whether it's on a statutory footing or not, there's elements of transparency around how it operates that could be improved that wouldn't require that. So things like the Treasury publishes the block grant transparency document, which is very helpful. They don't publish it very regularly. The last version was published in July 2023. We've had quite a lot of significant changes since then. Things like every fiscal event, if Treasury could clearly publish how it has operated, which elements of additional funding are being baselined for future years, which are non-recurring, those kind of transparency issues would help parliaments, both here and in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, understand what the funding position is and allow ourselves and other stakeholders to really understand how the Scottish Government's funding is changing. And then that might lead to greater scrutiny on some of the other issues that you've been talking about in terms of the level of funding and how it's changing over time.
Okay. So, do you think formalisation would impact the effectiveness of the formula in practice? If so, how?
I think formalisation of any formula, not necessarily just the Barnett formula, but if it is replaced, perhaps could change the degree of scrutiny around the operation of the formula and how it's changed. But that would, and as I said, it could potentially allow it to be challenged in court whilst the law is in place. But I think the kind of real impact there would be depending on kind of the extent to which it does increase the scrutiny by parliaments to do it. So there'd be a job for people in this committee and elsewhere in Parliament to make use of those powers. But I would agree very much with Claire that actually, statutory basis, changing the legal basis of it is one thing, but even without doing that, there's so much that can be done to improve the transparency around this, not just around the block grant transparency report, although that's very important, but also what's called the statement of funding policy, which sets out the sort of, rules and actually how they've calculated what's known as comparable spending, which is the basis on which they then, decide what is the increment in England that then goes into the Barnett formula to determine the Scottish budget changes. There's a lot of scope for improved transparency, and particularly in the context of the new formulas for Wales and Northern Ireland, which have some sort of needs element, a potential slow convergence in Scotland, which might push it closer towards needs levels in Scotland, actually publish regular assessments of what is the level of funding in Scotland compared to England, and how does that compare to some estimates of what funding is needed. There's a lot more scope for transparency to improve debate and improve the operation of the formula.
Okay. You may already have answered this, but do you think it would be beneficial to formalise the Barnett formula or put it on a statutory basis?
I think we're going to João for that one.
João, yeah.
I would say, I can't see that it would necessarily do any harm. I can't see that it would transform things either. So, I appreciate it's a bit of an equivocal answer, but I would argue that some of the perhaps more pressing issues are some of the ones that Claire and David brought up, particularly the statement of funding policy and how that's calculated. And actually, the fact that the Treasury is the ultimate arbiter of what those are, I think, is the really crucial point. And I don't know that necessarily requires formalization of it. It probably requires some agreement of, having some sort of third party that can arbitrate disputes, much like there are arbitrations of other disputes. That would probably be a way of thrashing out some of the disagreements about things like bypass of the formula, or designating some things for the benefit of the whole of the UK when they might be argued that they are not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. Some funding is delivered outside of the Barnett formula, projects such as the Glasgow City Region deal, for instance, which greatly benefits Glasgow and the west of Scotland, or the recently announced UK National Wealth Fund. To what extent do you think there's clear rationale there when it is and isn't done, and do you feel that undermines in any way the Barnett formula or supplements it?
So if I have a go at that first then. So I think there are several areas where the formula has been bypassed. You mentioned a few that I guess are sort of associated with economic development. There was also, for example, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund bypassed the Barnett formula, the Levelling Up funds. Historically, the rail funding was done separately from the Barnett formula, as was agricultural funding. Now, I think in each instance, it's been because a perception that they are kind of the particular nature of these spending items was that the way to assess, if you like, how much we spent in different countries needed to be done on a bespoke basis. So, for example, the UK SPF and agricultural funding was largely to place EU funds that didn't want a cliff edge. Let's kind of, if you like, grandfather those allocations in. They've now actually been rolled effectively into the Barnett formula going forwards. Same with the rail funding. Areas like, say, the city deals, or as you mentioned, the sort of National Wealth Fund, to some extent, they are sort of looking also not just at sort of needs, but also opportunities. So there's an element of appraisal of the sort of, potential benefits of spending in terms of certain investments. So I think, in a system of financing across the country, having a range of mechanisms that is sometimes, a standard formula, other times more bespoke for things that a national government wants to allocate across the country, but at some set of rules that it determines itself, I think is a reasonable basis. Even highly decentralized countries like, say, the United States has not just a federal government which is completely hands-off on areas where the devolved governments also have elements of control. But I think what's important is that there's a degree of coordination and communication about spending in areas where both devolved and central government has a role, like, for example, economic development, where they're both acting in that area.
And probably there's more need for transparency as well, and being very clear, and both the Scottish and UK governments could do that, being very clear about which parts of the block grant are coming through the Barnett formula, which parts are non-Barnett funding. Tracking that over time can be difficult, and then again it's knowing what's going to happen with that funding in the future, I think, is sometimes very uncertain. So we've had the agricultural funding has been outside the Barnett formula for a few years, and now being brought inside the Barnett formula. So but that's not necessarily completely transparent and clear to everybody involved in that, how it's working.
Okay.
Chair.
And then I'm going back to Lillian again now, Lillian Jones.
Thank you very much. So, João, you described the Treasury as the ultimate arbiters of the spending is Barnettised and what the comparability factors are. Should other parties be consulted on those decisions, and if so, who?
I think it's, yes, so the Treasury is definitely the ultimate arbiter. They published a statement of funding policy, and what they say essentially goes. There's been a lot of this debate, not necessarily within Scotland relating to this, but in Wales there's been a lot of discussion about whether HS2 should be an England and Wales or an England only project, for example, and things like that. And there was the Olympics case, for example, where spending was deemed for the benefit of the whole of the UK and therefore non-manageable, although that is a while ago now. But I think there's definitely a strong case that there should be other parties that are consulted, but at least, if there is a reasonable case to raise a dispute, there should be some sort of mechanism for that to be raised. And at the moment, that doesn't exist. It all relies on political pressure. Some sort of, independent, like jointly nominated panel that might arbitrate about this, for example, would be, I think, a reasonable solution to ensure that both the Scottish government and the UK government can come to an agreement about any disputes that might occur in the future.
This could be another example where a sort of statutory basis could have a role, because I think my view is that the design of the allocation process is ultimately a political decision, and therefore the rules need to be determined by politicians. But the operation of those rules is a sort of a question where I think there's a role for potentially whether an independent voice or a legal voice to determine whether they are always being followed in those circumstances. So, for example, in the German case, there's finance constitution, which means that, for example, one rule is that any burden placed on lower levels of government by higher level government needs to be funded. And then the lower levels of government can go to the finance courts, constitutional courts, to argue if they think that's not been the case, and the court can be a judgment on that. And you could have a similar situation, whether it's arbitration or whether it's kind of via sort of special courts, to decide these are the rules of the Barnett formula, which have been agreed by UK Parliament and so on, are they being applied correctly in this instance?
What more do you think the UK government could do to ensure the process is more transparent?
I mean, on the transparency point, there's publication of information on how it's calculated, how much the government's receiving, how much of that is baselined, how much of it's not baselined, how much is outside Barnett. That could be clearer, and it could be clearer between fiscal events, how it's changing over time. It's sometimes hard to work out. Each government might say their funding is going up, some will say it's going down, it's all calculated on a different basis. So the clearer that information is, the more the independent voices like us can then say, well, this is what we think is actually happening. I think there's elements around the Barnett formula itself which could be more transparent, but there's also general things the UK government could do which would help make the fiscal process in general clearer. So the commitment to have multi-year spending reviews, clearer timings for fiscal events, which mean there's greater certainty for the Scottish Government in planning its budget. Those things would be helpful. There's also, the recent announcement at the UK budget around employer national insurance contributions with an unclear level of funding that's been allocated means the Scottish Government's had to set its budget without including the impact of employer NICS changes. That is probably, as significant or more significant in terms of the impact on the Scottish budget than potentially some things in terms of the exact operation of the Barnett formula. It's more the general certainty around how the fiscal landscape is looking, what changes are being made and what impact they have on the funding, confirming that early, confirming that publicly, and then allowing the government, not just in Scotland, this will also apply to Wales and Northern Ireland as well, but allowing the devolved administrations time and certainty to plan their budgets.
And if I may add on that, I think that transparency is often an issue not just for the UK government, but also to some extent for the devolved governments. There's also more that the Scottish government can do to be transparent about its own budget decisions as well. So, for example, sometime this week or next week, we're expecting what they call the spring budget revision, which is a bit like the supplementary estimates at the UK government level. They're published on a different sort of financial basis than the budget figures that are used and discussed in general discourse. Trying to work out how the figures are changing when you have these updated spending estimates is quite difficult. So I think that all round there's more scope for transparency, both between the UK government and the devolved governments, but also within the devolved governments themselves.
I would very much agree that the different bases is a huge issue and is something that needs really to be resolved. And there's been some movement towards a more comparable basis from the Scottish Government, which has been welcome. But it still is a different budget basis to what the Treasury publishes. And I don't really see why these publications should be referred to on different bases. And it makes it very hard for us to explain to the general public why that is. The other thing I would say is some of the transparency releases, for example, that the Treasury puts out, it's all well and good for us to troll through them, but actually just a lot of data does not mean information. It just means a lot of data. So there is a role there to try and explain things a bit more and make sure that people can understand what it is, and interested members of the public can go and find it out instead of having to do it for a living like we do. And I'm not trying to do ourselves out of a job, but it would be nice if we could delve beyond this is how we had to spend this much time going through it, and these are the results, to actually explaining what it is.
If I may, I want to get the word pivot table into this evidence. The Treasury can make its pivot tables in Excel more useful. So they're simple things where it's actually making the data that's there more accessible, not just for kind of general members of the public, but even for ourselves to access. So it might sound like a very technical, minor thing, but as João said, data can just be kind of, it's just additional things to wade through without that sort of infrastructure to help you understand and make use of that data.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a supplementary from Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for those answers. Just in relation to the national insurance aspect, and I think it probably ties in with a wider point, because not only do we have the Scottish Government in a position where it's obviously setting its budget without clarity in that respect, local authorities right across Scotland right now are in the exact same position where they're obviously making determinations in relation to council tax, potential council tax rises without having certainty over what the national insurance rises look like for them either. That probably goes to the wider point in relation to the winter fuel allowance as well, where there was a systemic change in the funding which is available with 20 minutes notice, 30 minutes notice that was happening. Have you sensed any appetite or change with the new government to provide earlier and swifter clarity to the Scottish Government in that respect?
So it's a good question. I think the change that we saw to winter fuel payments, for example, at the UK level was the first time there had been a significant in-year change to a social security payment, which the Scottish Government obviously chose to respond to by replicating in Scotland for this year. I think there's certainly signs that the whole system should become potentially a little bit more suitable for the government in terms of clarity around when fiscal events are taking place. We've obviously got the first UK spending review of this Parliament due in June with a 3-year outlook, and then a commitment to have that on an ongoing basis. Those, if followed through, should give the Scottish Government more certainty. But we have also heard commitments before about moving to one fiscal event, and then that hasn't happened. So it's a bit hard for me to answer that in a sort of politically neutral way. But I think there's signs that it could become clearer and smoother for the government, and we would certainly welcome that, because we've made a lot of statements about how the Scottish Government should be doing more multi-year planning to give certainty to local authorities, public bodies. And there's elements where, when you have a very uncertain funding position, there's more need to do that planning rather than less need. But at the same time, it's important to recognise that if you don't have the outlook from the UK government in terms of the funding position, which is ultimately the most significant component of the Scottish Government's budget, that is a very difficult thing to do, both practically and also politically as well.
David?
The one thing I would say is that I think that as well as there being sort of formal communication between the governments at a formal level, there is sort of informal communication between Treasury and Scottish Government officials. Obviously cannot give kind of full details about exactly what the spending announcements are and the political, policies that are being made, but that, if you like, gives a little bit of mood music to help the Scottish Government understand what might be coming down the line. Now, did a project back in 2021 with colleagues from Fraser of Allander and from Stirling University, which asked a bit about how the fiscal framework was working during COVID. And the information we got there was that actually that sort of communication was very, very prevalent during the COVID pandemic. There was lots of sort of back and forth communication between Treasury and Scottish Government officials during that time period, perhaps as a sort of, UK-wide crisis. My hope would be, whilst kind of respecting the need to kind of keep certain political announcements confidential, that there can be a degree of communication at the official level to help officials understand what's coming down the line. But that does then require officials potentially to withhold some information from their political masters.
Oh.
I would say that so obviously there were the changes that were announced earlier in the year, and there's although there are signs that there is more dialogue than there had been before, and I think that was evident in the fact that the Scottish Government was able to plan better in terms of their autumn budget revisions than they might have done had they not had any information about what was coming down the track in the autumn budget. There are some difficulties that, although there is a better mood music, are still there and that are going to be very much tested in the next couple of months, I think. One is, in particular, is the fact that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is committed to only having one full fiscal event a year, but with the fiscal rules potentially being breached if she were to do nothing, then there is a very real chance that there will be changes in the spring budget, or sorry, the spring statement, that would come after the Scottish Government has already passed its budget for 2025-26. And therefore, that is kind of locked in. Obviously, the Scottish Government can do budget revisions during the year, but it has much fewer levers to do that in year than the UK government does, and therefore there's an imbalance of immediate levers there, in which the Scottish government might find itself having a different Barnett settlement than it expected, for example, both more or less depending on the situation. In this case, we think that it could be less, and then the question is that at the time that is conducive to good policy making and decision making by the Scottish government? And I would argue it's not. And the fact that the Scottish government has more fiscal powers, as Claire explained before, actually means that it is more dependent on UK government fiscal events because of the interactions between the forecasts of the SFC and the OBR. And the other thing that I think is slightly worrisome in terms of the timing of these fiscal events, if I may just make this point, is the spending review being postponed until June, which Claire will probably not be looking too much forward to, because it's likely that the Scottish Fiscal Commission would be doing a forecast either before or around the same time as that spending review, and it just doesn't seem like it should be the case that would have to happen before decisions over the next few years are communicated to the Scottish government, and then the Scottish government has the opportunity to decide what to do with the allocation. So I think there are some difficulties in terms of timing that haven't been resolved. Perhaps they can't fully be resolved, but I think we're going to face a stern test in the next couple of months as to whether that is going to rear its head again.
Another brief supplementary from Stephen.
That's incredibly helpful, and I think all of us are very conscious of that in the weeks and months to come, given the constraints that the Chancellor's obviously has in place with regards to those fiscal rules. But just to take a little step back, when you were previously talking about a dispute, the potential for a dispute mechanism to be put in place in order to resolve some challenges which may or may not exist. We're obviously months down the line now since the National Insurance announcement was made. Do you think that provides an argument, not necessarily for a dispute mechanism, but perhaps for a statutory mechanism to be put in place where the UK government has to provide clarity to the devolved governments with regards to where spending sits? Because we seem to be sitting in this system at the moment now where clarity isn't there, and it's at the behest of one party to be able to provide that, and other parties sitting waiting. Okay, formal structure help there?
I realise the question wasn't as brief as I thought it was going to be, but if we could have brief answers, that'd be really helpful.
I have no comment on that question, I'm afraid. I think that trying to put in place a formal rule here might run into issues in the sense that the UK government will often make changes within a year for good reasons as well, perhaps topping up funding during the course of the year. So that any rule on this would need to be written to allow there to be some degree of flexibility within the year. But yes, I would need to think more about kind of how this could work in the context of issues like the national insurance before I could give a proper answer.
I think there's clear challenges around this particular example, but there are also examples in the past where Treasury has shown great flexibility to the Scottish Government, such as when there have been late changes that have come through supplementary estimates that would have a negative effect on the budget. Treasury has allowed them to be deferred. When there were drawdown limits on the Scotland Reserve, the Scottish Government had kind of funding there. They had large negative consequentials. They were allowed to draw down more than they should have been. So there's elements where, in this particular example, it's challenging for the government, but there have also been many examples where Treasury has shown greater flexibility. So I guess there's a bit of seeing how this pans out and what the governments agree and what the level of funding is. And I suspect that while this is a clear issue for the devolved administrations, it's also going to be an issue in England for local authorities, public bodies. So it's not a uniquely Scottish challenge as well.
Want to add anything, João?
Nothing to add.
Okay. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about, and it's maybe following on a slight theme here, about situations where there might be a disagreement about decisions to bypass the formula. So if I could ask Claire firstly, does the Scottish Fiscal Commission play any role in such disputes or disagreements?
Essentially, no. There's some provision in the fiscal framework where there are particular disputes around spillovers that Treasury and the Scottish Government could approach ourselves and the OBR, but those mechanisms have never been used. I think there's a risk around, elements of the decisions around Barnett about what's baseline, what's non-Barnett, are essentially political decisions, and bringing an organisation like ours into those would potentially sort of challenge our political neutrality on that. So I think we haven't been asked, and we would hopefully not be asked, I think, on that.
Are there any, are those issues, do they happen often?
I think that's probably a question the Scottish Government itself would be better placed to answer. There's always some things, but I think, the examples that we're talking about on HS2, the Olympics, you're looking over a 15-year period with two major examples there. There's probably smaller things that are resolved behind the scenes between the two governments without becoming public.
That's helpful. I'm going to go to João now, because I know that Fraser of Allander in one of their papers suggested that there might be need for an actual sort of third-party resolution mechanism. Is that something that you think is needed still?
So I think we mentioned that in particular in relation to the statement of funding policy, because the Treasury essentially has all the power and there's no recourse. I think it would be beneficial. We think at the Fraser Allander it would be beneficial to have some sort of mechanism that, like we talked before, where this could potentially be challenged and in a way that is less heated politically, and therefore more to do with the actual operation and the underlying principles of it. Obviously, it's beyond our scope to and our remit to say whether that is a priority that should happen or not. But we think it would be positive.
Okay, David, do you have a view?
Yeah. So they are somewhat different. So there are dispute mechanisms within the system, both for the operation of the Barnett formula and the statement of funding policy, and then for the other elements of the fiscal framework that Claire mentioned. Now, my understanding is those work in somewhat different ways. So that if it's for the Barnett formula, in effect, it goes through a process by being raised sort of through official levels and then up to sort of ministerial levels through what's called the Finance Interministerial Standing Committee, which is made up of representatives of the UK and devolved governments. But this is a consultative rather than decision-making body, and the final decision-making power on the Barnett formula still always rests with the Treasury. Now, with the other aspects of the fiscal framework, like the block grant adjustments or spillover effects, there is potentially to be disputes on both sides of the system. Yeah. And therefore, rather than, say, the Treasury's view always carrying, if they can't reach a resolution, it's the default rules that carry under the fiscal framework. So I think there's a bit of a difference, if you like, between how the Barnett formula is sort of disputed, where ultimately if you can't reach an agreement, Treasury says so, and the other aspects where if you can't reach an agreement, the default rules apply. That is where something like an independent mechanism or the potential to see whether the operation is being applied correctly via, a court, if it's made on a statutory basis, that could provide sort of more balanced approach, if you like, on the Barnett formula side of things as well.
That's very helpful. We are now going to move on to some questions about the fiscal framework. I'll hand over to Susan Murray to begin.
Thank you, Chair. The Scottish Government, and I'm going to quote here, has highlighted that the transfer of risk to the Scottish Parliament following fiscal devolution must be matched by the policy and budgetary levers required to mitigate and manage such risk. Do you think the current fiscal framework achieves that balance? So I'll ask David and then go to...
Okay, so the fiscal framework has several sort of mechanisms that are designed to help address risks a Scottish Government could otherwise face. The first one, which is often not thought about, is the way the block grant adjustments work. Because the block grant adjustments for tax, for example, are linked to the tax revenues in England and Northern Ireland. That means if there's a recession that hits the whole of the UK, which means Scotland's revenue goes down, well, revenues also like to go down in England and Northern Ireland. The block grant adjustments are linked to that. They will go down as well. So Scottish revenues fall, but so do the block grant adjustments. that insulates the Scottish Government from a fair proportion of the risk associated with, for example, global economic shocks, UK-wide economic shocks. But of course, that's not the only kind of sort of issue that can arise with the tax devolution. There could be a Scotland-specific shock, perhaps, for example, if there's a decline in the oil and gas industry that's bigger than elsewhere in the economy, that will have a particular impact on the Scottish Government's income tax take from oil and gas workers and those supporting them. As Claire mentioned, there's also issues around the forecasts where not only might the forecasts be wrong, but the SFC and the OBR might take different positions on what's going to happen to wage growth or employment growth, and that adds an element of noise to the process as well. Now, to address the parts that the block grant adjustments don't do, the Scottish Government has borrowing powers and it has some reserve powers. Now, when we initially looked at this, I'll say, we thought that the borrowing powers, given that the cycles of the Scottish and UK economies move, fairly closely together, those borrowing powers look like they might be sufficient. But that omitted this sort of forecasting issue, really, that Claire mentioned, that even if the cycles are moving in step, because you've got two different organisations making forecasts with different judgments, and that adds some noise into the process, actually, the sort of forecast errors you get in terms of the net tax position or the net social security position could quite often exceed the initial borrowing levels the Scottish Government was given under the fiscal framework. Now, they've made some changes under a sort of negotiation in 2023 that removed some of the limits that applied. It has increased the limits in line with inflation going forwards. That has definitely improved the situation. But I think there's a case that it could go further in a couple of dimensions. One is that typically the revenue and spending under risk will go up by more than inflation. We hope there's economic growth, and also social security spending has been going up with a sort of a rising disability benefits bill. Both of those things mean that the amount of money at risk is going up by more than inflation, and I would suggest linking the borrowing limits not to inflation but some estimate of the sort of funding that's under risk. That could be linking it to GDP growth, or perhaps linking it to forecast growth in the rest of the UK revenues and spending on these benefits. The second issue is that the fiscal framework gives the Scottish Government powers to borrow if there's a forecast error for tax forecasts or for social security spending, but not if there's a shock to public service spending. Let's say, for example, public sector pay deals are coming much higher in Scotland than they have expected. The same is not true of England. The Scottish Government can't borrow to cover that at the moment. It needs to kind of find in-year savings within its budget. I think there's a case to say at least a small amount of borrowing for discretionary purposes for the Scottish Government, not just for forecast errors for tax and social security, but that can cope with other shocks or other things that arise during the year. Now, because there is no England-only borrowing in our system, I don't think we can have these powers being indefinite and the Scottish Government setting its own limits. I think for fairness to England, effectively, which won't have these borrowing powers, there should be some limits. But saying the Scottish Government can borrow 1 or 2% of its budget up to a certain cap in total to smooth these other sorts of pressures that might hit the public service budget, I think would improve the situation and give it more flexibility to respond, not just to shocks to taxes and social security benefits, but also public sector wage bills, flooding, other things that affect the public service budgets.
I could just add a couple of points and then João can come in. So I think on there's certain elements that give the Scottish Government certainty. So income tax is fixed at the time the budget is set. So it's fixed based on what we forecast, and the block grant adjustment is fixed based on the OBR's forecast of UK government revenues. And as the largest tax, that gives the government an element of certainty in its coming year's budget. Obviously, when the forecasts then come in later, there's then a reconciliation which applies, but the government can choose to borrow against that and then repay it over 3 to 5 years. So they can smooth the kind of effects out on that a little bit. But it is worth saying they can only, as David has very eloquently explained, they can only borrow for forecast error. So if there is a Scottish-specific economic shock, for example, which we forecast and factors into our forecast, and we think that income tax revenues would be lower in Scotland whilst they remain higher in the rest of the UK, the Scottish Government wouldn't be able to access borrowing for that. So that's one, I suppose, potential challenge. Although we haven't seen it generally, as David said, the cycles follow broadly similarly, and it's more been issues around timing of fiscal events, where particularly during the pandemic, where we had a UK fiscal event, a gap, and some significant announcements happened, and then we were forecasting, that presented challenges. And then the final point, which I'll make is just a little bit separately, is more about the challenges the Scottish Government has in general balancing its budget. So they have to balance their budget while using these limited borrowing powers. They can't overspend, but also they don't want a significant underspend either, because they can't put terribly much in the reserve in relation to the size of the budget. So there's a lot of decisions the government's having to balance as it goes through the financial year. As the UK government changed its spending plans, you get funding through the block grant. Barnett consequentials will come. We've also got changes to the tax forecast, not income tax, the other taxes, changes to social security spending, changes to the OBR forecast. And all of these things are changing, and the government's having to hit that kind of narrow balancing point at the end of the year. And I think it's important to recognise that is actually quite challenging for the government. Now, how that should be resolved, David's made a few suggestions. We wouldn't take a view on that. But it is, I think, important to recognise it can be difficult for the government to do that, and they are having to make decisions that give them that flexibility to manage it as the year goes on.
Can I follow up on that point, please, Chair? Then maybe it's one that Joe could answer. It's on that point that Claire raised.
Yes, I was about to take a supplementary from Kirstine Sullivan, so I'll do that first, if I may. Kirstine.
Thank you very much. I'll just pick up on the point that you made clear around really the Scotland's reserves capacity and the limits on that. I was just wondering if there has been a recent example of the Scottish Government having to hand back money to the UK Government because it hasn't been spent in time.
I don't think so. I think since the reserve came in, they've never hit the limit on the reserve. Generally, how the Scottish Government's managing its budget, they assume a level of resource borrowing and capital borrowing, and then as the year goes on, generally what we see is those borrowing assumptions come down and they actually borrow less, and effectively they're using their borrowing limits as a tool for making sure they don't have too big an underspend. So before you put money in the reserve, they generally reduce the amount they borrow first, and then there's an underspend after those decisions have been made, which is smaller. Recent years, they haven't fully used the reserve limits. 5 years ago, they were closer to some of those limits, and it was particularly challenging when they had drawdown limits. So they could, if they put some money in it, they could only draw a certain amount of that down each year, which meant you could end up with not being able to fully sort of fill it, or not be. But that's not. And then now the drawdown limits have been removed. That's less of an issue than it was in the past. But the scale of the reserve is still, it's predominantly used for underspends. So some of the things which people talk about is, well, if you had a year with bumper tax revenues, you could put that in the reserve and use that to fund spending in future years. It's quite hard for the government to do that because of the size of the reserve. It's predominantly at capacity for underspend.
And on that point, there has been a case where Wales has lost money that it has been able to spend. That wasn't as part of the normal reserves, but during the COVID pandemic, in 2020-21, because there was kind of a late increase in funding from the UK government to the devolved governments, they let them carry forward money on top of the normal reserve powers. That happened in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and in fact actually allowed Wales, Scotland and Ireland to spend more in the second year of the pandemic than was spent in England, where that money wasn't sort of carried forward in the departmental budgets. Wales had hoped to get sort of dispensation to carry forward more on top of the reserves again in into 22-23. Treasury said no, and Wales lost, I think, a couple of £100 million from that. But the Scottish Government did get the money out of the door in 21-22 and didn't lose that money.
Douglas McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. Should we be concerned that the forecast error reconciliations which you speak about could exceed the resource borrowing limits? For this year, some estimates are forecasting over 700 million when the limit is actually 600 million. And how does the Scottish Government get itself out of that mess?
I can go first and João can come in. So that's an estimate of the reconciliation at the moment. That's based on our latest forecast, the OBR's latest forecasts. Both could move around. So what we're, particularly on income tax, we're forecasting very large sums of money. So relatively small forecast errors, and the OBR are doing the same effectively at the UK, can end up with quite big reconciliations, even if we're not making very large forecast errors. So we did some analysis in the past, which looked at the previous limits that suggested actually we could quite regularly be breaching the limits as they were at that point. We're hopefully going to redo that analysis. I think given they're increasing with inflation, but earnings growth and income tax revenues have increased faster than inflation, so it's likely that they will be exceeded as is currently projected. It's worth saying, though, that obviously the forecast at the moment is a reconciliation over 700 million against a borrowing limit that was, I think, 640 in that year. But obviously that means that they can borrow the 640, so the gap that they will have to plug in the year will be more like 150, I can't remember the exact numbers. That will then reduce the amount they have to spend in the year that income tax reconciliation comes in, and then they will be paying back a negative reconciliation from the borrowing over the subsequent 3 to 5 years, depending on how long they borrow. But effectively what that reconciliation is that they received more money than they should have done in a previous year. So it's more about, it's not necessarily like a bad thing that you have a reconciliation. It's an outcome of just smoothing income tax revenues over years. But it does create these challenges for the Scottish Government in how it's managing its budget.
João, did you want to come in on that one?
If I can come in, I would say that there's a reasonable argument to be made that this is exactly the sort of thing that we should be worried about, and why some of these limits, although I understand why they were put in, because you're starting a new process and you're creating a new framework, and you want to encourage responsible behavior by all parties involved in disbursing the Scottish budget. Really, it probably does not make sense to have such hard limits on this kind of thing. And certainly, they were frozen in cash terms. Now they go up in inflation. I think it's a very reasonable argument for them to go up with nominal GDP, which just would take some of this, these hard decisions, or the edge of some of these hard decisions. But ultimately, the Scottish Government might be put in a position where they might have to do this reconciliation at a time when there could be a shock, and they would have less money to spend on public services than would be ideal. And Claire is right. They probably shouldn't have got this money if these forecasts are correct, but ultimately they did, and you might be causing the wrong kind of fiscal impulse at the time when these reconciliations come through. So I think this kind of illustrates the point that these kind of limits probably shouldn't exist, and the same thing that they probably shouldn't exist for the Scotland Reserve. There's a very good argument that you should allow a parliament to make its own decisions about how it wants to smooth things out across time. I understand that some of the borrowing limits are there because the Scottish Government can borrow at very preferential rates from the National Loans Fund, and so you want to encourage some responsible borrowing behavior. But as we put in our submission, there are some more radical ways in which you could reimagine the fiscal framework that would allow the Scottish Government to have more limited borrowing powers from the National Loans Fund, but some other ways of borrowing that would allow it more flexibility and probably improve the way they can manage risk in things like this reconciliation.
This may be a naive question from me, but if there was an issue, could the Scottish Government not just lift a phone to the UK Government and say, we need a little bit of flexibility here? Can we get temporary access, or a little bit more, or a little bit of movement somewhere? Would that not work, especially when we're hearing the relationship is being reset? So that is kind of how it happened during COVID, but that was kind of an emergency situation. So that is more reasonable that would be the case then. But
I think it would be beneficial for everyone in terms of transparency and also predictability, and kind of guarding against the fact that relations might not always be as good as they are, or they might not improve and things like that. So in the interest of predictability and guarding against uncertainty, it would be good to have more flexibility there. And I don't think the risks are as high as they were necessarily thought to be when the fiscal framework was first introduced.
Okay, thank you. David?
I may come in very briefly. I think one could distinguish between borrowing for forecast errors and other forms of borrowing. So I think a limit on what the Scottish Government can borrow for discretionary borrowing, whether that's under capital spending, as it currently can, or if there's an expansion of borrowing powers of resource to kind of more discretionary borrowing to cover shortfalls in revenue that are forecast in advance, as Claire mentioned, or shocks to public service spending that I mentioned. I think having some limits for those makes sense. For forecast errors, provided the forecasts are being made by independent bodies such as the OBR and SFC, then that is not something the Scottish Government has control over. So it can't, for example, say, oh, let's over-forecast our revenues now and get more money in, and we can borrow, and this problem gets pushed down the line 5-10 years, because they're not doing the forecasts. The SFC and the OBR are. I think that makes it more reasonable to say, well, let's actually either substantially increase those borrowing limits for forecast errors specifically, or even potentially say it doesn't need to be a limit for that, because this is just a bit of the operation of the fiscal framework. What I would say is, though, like any borrowing, it needs to come with interest, not just be interest-free, which I think is something the Scottish Government has said in its submission to this inquiry. So I can explain why in a second if you would like me to, but any borrowing under, whether it's forecast errors or other borrowing, needs to have interest attached. But I think there's a case to say for forecast errors, let's just kind of remove the limits completely, because it's being, that the borrowing is for something that's outside of the Scottish Government's control, not something it can kind of influence itself.
Thank you. Elaine Stewart.
Morning. I'm sorry for being late this morning, and it's just on the back of what you were speaking about there. So do you think the Scottish Government should not pay interest in borrowing when such borrowing is done to cover forecast errors?
I think it should pay interest, and I'll explain why. So, for example, let's suppose the UK government was to have a forecast error for income tax. At the start of the year, it sets its spending plans assuming that it'll get a certain amount of income tax. Income tax turns out to be less positive. It gets less. It needs to borrow that money in that year. It needs to pay interest on that. In the same way, the Scottish Government is working. It sets its budget at the start of the year when it thinks income tax revenues will be a certain level. It turns out that they're not. In the short term, at least, that's not a matter for the Scottish Government. It doesn't need to pay it off for 3 years. In effect, it's getting a 3-year interest-free loan on that at the moment, and then starts to pay interest after those 3 years once the reconciliation has been done. So already, to some extent, it's getting a better deal, if you like, on addressing forecast errors than the UK government does. Making it completely interest-free means it gets the money up front, where, the fact that inflation hasn't taken place, the fact that, it can be put into the bank if you wanted to, means that, the value of that money up front is more than it is later. That's what interest is there for. So the fact that money up front is better than money later, it works for the UK government. That's why we need to pay interest on our debt. Same for the Scottish Government.
Thank you.
If it were borrowed, someone has to pay the interest. And if it's not the Scottish Government, it would be the UK government paying it, I think it's very reasonable for it to be charged interest.
That's interesting. Thank you very much. Christine Stewart. Oh, sorry, Christine Sullivan. Sorry, I can't even remember committee members' names. That's dreadful. Sorry, Christine.
It's all right. I thought it was the famous actress had arrived. It's just me. Yes, so I was going to ask about the fact that the Scottish Government is required to run a broadly balanced budget each year and isn't permitted to overspend. Can you just go into some detail, and I suspect probably yourself, if we start with you, Claire, why this is the case and what implications that has on the fiscal flexibility of the Scottish Government?
I mean, essentially the rules are set out as part of the Statement of Funding Policy, the fiscal framework. The government doesn't have access to what we would call resource borrowing for any purposes other than forecast error. So, and I think David and João have talked about how the fiscal stance of the UK is a reserved matter. So sort of the overall level of borrowing is set by the UK government. And then the Scottish Government receives the funding based on the UK government spending. Obviously, the Scottish Government then has a little bit of choice about how it sets its tax policy, how it chooses to spend its money. And they can access the resource borrowing for forecast error for taxes and social security. But other than that, they have to balance their budget. And that we've talked about how there's sort of more components of the budget that are variable, but even within the spending side of it alone, you know, you're managing departments, spending billions of pounds, having to balance that budget. And the government, they have always balanced it. They can put any underspends they have can go in the reserve, subject to the £700 million limit. As I mentioned earlier, how when the government's managing its budget in the year, they're balancing a lot of different things. And one of the tools that they do use, and we see them use, is that they plan to borrow for capital and resource generally, and then reduce that as the year goes through as a way of, I suppose, release. It means that they reduce the size of their underspend, and then that frees up resource for future years. I think one of the things we always like to see and would hope to see at the spring budget revision is a level of transparency from the government about where they think the budget is going to end up and what level of funding is therefore available to support spending in future years.
Yeah, if I might come in a second. So I agree much with what Claire says there. I think when saying the Scottish Government balances its budget, I think it's important to note that means that it's following the fiscal rules it needs to adhere to. It isn't actually balancing its budget really each year. And I think João has done some work looking at this because it has been typically, on average, borrowing a bit to cover reconciliations for forecast errors. Because it is borrowing for capital investment, there has been, on average, and João can correct me if I'm wrong, around £500 million a year of net borrowing by the Scottish Government since this fiscal framework came into place in around 2016. I think this kind of, we always balance our budget, is also sometimes used in the context of sort of debates around Scotland's overall fiscal position. And of course, that ignores the fact that the UK government borrows on behalf of the Scottish Government, and because spending is higher, revenues are not, Scotland has a higher than population share of the UK borrowing effect being done on its behalf. So I think whilst it's true that the Scottish Government has always managed within the fiscal rules of its own operation, that has been using some of the borrowing it can do and uses borrowed money that the UK government's borrowed on its behalf.
I think it's very clear that the Scottish Government does not. So it balances its cash requirements every year. So it means that it can meet its requirements, but that means that, you can tell that it borrows money because they've got debt that they've issued, and that's perfectly fine within the rules, but they do run a small deficit every year of around £500 million, as David said. There's some work that we've done on this. Obviously, in some years, it has actually run a surplus, and it has allowed some of that additional revenue or lower spending to allow them to spend some extra money in future years. But I think it's slightly misleading what is sometimes said that they always balance their budget. I think what David said, that they always adhere to the fiscal rules, is a more meaningful statement.
Thank you. And if I could just follow up and ask, in your view, what would be the benefits and risks of changing this restriction, of following the fiscal rules?
So if
to put it in that context rather than saying to balance the budget.
So if if the Scottish government were allowed to borrow more, for example, it could then try and, for example, stimulate activity more. Obviously, that does incur a risk. Someone has to, you can either borrow from a very safe source, which you can do at the moment, but there are limits on how much you can do and purposes for which you can do from the National Loans Fund. But it could, borrow. It could be changed to allow them to borrow from the market in a less capped way, for example. But then there's a question of with whom does the ultimate responsibility lie in terms of if fiscal policy were not to be run sustainably. This is always a trade-off in terms of risk and responsibility, and so that would allow the Scottish government perhaps to have more power to influence the economy if were there to be a Scotland-specific shock. There's a provision that has been eliminated from the latest fiscal framework agreement, but obviously carries risk, and it's the appetite to which that people might have for that depends. It's a political decision ultimately whether to follow that or not.
Thank you.
If you wanted a supplementary,
yes, please. I wonder what you think of this theory. So I was a Highland councillor and borrowed 1.2 billion. And I've just looked it up, but apparently the UK Government Public Works Loan Board lent 22 billion to councils in Scotland as of 2023. Do you think this is a way of the Scottish Government effectively borrowing by underfunding councils and leaving the leaving the loan problem with them, the debt problem with them?
So if I might come in on that one first. So I think kind of borrowing by local government is normalised across the whole of the UK. So English local authorities have also borrowed significant amounts of money, whether that is for investing in roads, schools and so on, or to invest in commercial property, which I think has been a bigger factor in some of the borrowing of English councils as well. So I wouldn't want to sort of make a claim that borrowing by Scottish councils is indicative of if you like, underfunding by the Scottish Government, in particular because councils' borrowing is also subject to a rule that it's for capital investment. Councils cannot borrow to fund day-to-day spending. They can only borrow for capital investment. So, if the argument was that to some extent this reflects not providing enough funding to councils, that would have to be on the capital side rather than the day-to-day side of the budget. If I might come in very quickly, if it's possible, to add a kind of supplementary answer to Kirstein's question very quickly. The point I'd make there is that there's two types of risks, I think, that are often discussed about kind of giving the Scottish Government more borrowing powers. One is, if you like, risks to the UK's sort of fiscal situation. We've looked at that, and because Scotland and, in fact, all the devolved nations together are pretty small in the context of the overall UK economy, that probably isn't the case that giving the Scottish Government more borrowing powers, even increasing them, doubling them, trebling them, would really affect the UK's fiscal credibility. But I think I would come back to this kind of point of fairness, because at the moment, any borrowing the UK government does is for the whole of the UK. It's either to fund UK-wide things like defence and pensions, or it's to fund things that are devolved, which means Scotland gets a share of the borrowing via the Barnett formula. That means there's no England-only borrowing. Even if Scotland pays back what it borrows, the fact is wanting more borrowing powers shows that borrowing power is actually valuable. And if Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have, they have local authority borrowing powers, they have UK government borrowing powers, and this additional devolved borrowing power that's uncapped, that is potentially unfair to England, which doesn't have that separate element of borrowing powers. So that's, I think, a risk is sort of not just on the sort of the fiscal side of things, but also, if you like, to kind of fiscal equity across the whole of the UK.
Thank you. Can I ask, the current cap of £700 million on the Scottish reserves, does that affect the ability of the Scottish Government to manage its finances as effectively as it might?
So the first thing I would say is that is a higher limit than equivalent English departments would get with the same budget. So there is an additional amount there that the Scottish Government gets to borrow. But of course, the Scottish Government is not just like an English department. It's its own political decision-making body. It's managing a wider range of risks, especially now with the Social Security benefits, which in Scotland are effectively treated like departmental expenditure limits as opposed to annually managed expenditure. So you'd expect there to be a higher borrowing limit. I'll hand over to Claire, because I think Claire was saying that, this does still pose challenges, and it's basically that the Scottish Government has been using its borrowing powers to sort of help, flex the reserve powers as well.
And there's one thing I should add to that answer as well, is that the ScotWind proceeds that the Scottish Government received has actually effectively been used as a reserve. So they've often planned to draw down from the ScotWind funding and then haven't necessarily drawn down as much as they planned and then used that in future years. I think all the points David makes I'd agree with, and I think there's an element of it. If they had a larger reserve, for example, they could have a choice about how the Scottish Government allocated funding. So we had an example a few years ago where the timing of ours and the OBR forecast meant we thought that our forecast, the gap between the income tax forecast was kind of artificially high, and we said this will lead to a negative reconciliation. And in theory, if you had a sufficiently large reserve, the government could have paid that money into the reserve to manage that in future years. However, politically, that's quite a difficult thing to do. So there's sort of the practical realities of how this might work, and then there's the political realities that might be slightly different.
Oh, do you want to add anything?
I would just say that I cannot really see a reason why you wouldn't want to allow the Scottish Government, and which is accountable to the Scottish Parliament as well. And so there's a further interaction there in terms of the fact that you have these decision-making bodies which could, for very good reasons, decide to allocate spending over time differently. And I cannot see any reason why they should be forced not to do that when, it could be perfectly well argued for.
Thank you. Elaine Stewart.
Are there any other changes to the current fiscal framework that you think could enable the Scottish Government to more effectively manage its fiscal position?
So, if I can come in first, I think there is one thing that the Scottish Government is very limited in terms of its ability to do, and which would help it plan for the future and respond to shocks, which is the lack of flexibility that they have within the year. So at the moment, the way the Scottish budget works, it's passed before the financial year starts. There's some revisions that can be made, but ultimately, some big chunks of its revenues, including, for example, the income tax forecasts, they're set in stone, and that means that quite often it ends up in a position where it's trying to allocate quite large amounts of money. Not wanting, as Claire said, to leave too much unallocated for understandable reasons, but also trying to manage this risk of some changes in the year that it hasn't fully accounted for. So some more flexibility for changes within year would be good, whether that's achieved through the fiscal framework itself or some other way of doing it, I think would be helpful, because what you want to guard against is kind of almost having this stop-start way of budget setting, and you want to stop having kind of fiscal impulses when you tell people that you're going to spend this much, and then it turns out you can't. So you're also causing potentially projects to stop-start. So that I think would be an improvement to the fiscal framework as a whole, or at least to the Scottish Government's budgets, control of the budget process, which with a grown-up parliament that it has, it should really be allowed to do, I think.
Maybe just on the back of that, was there anything in the fiscal framework that we would have liked to have seen agreed that wasn't?
I would like to have seen the VAT assignment, kind of just everyone to agree that it's not sensible in the way it was thought to be implemented. And I can't see how another few years of work are going to come up to a different conclusion other than it doesn't work.
Thank you.
I could add one thing to the, sort of maybe the previous question. I think not so specifically about the fiscal framework, but more generally about the Scottish Government's budget. You know, our fiscal sustainability work has looked at some of the long-term challenges the government has. We've got real changes coming through demographic change, the challenges to meet net zero, some of the commitments the government has on child poverty. There's like real fundamental challenges that are facing the government, and the need to plan its budget not just 1 year ahead, but thinking about several years. And that there hasn't been the space to do that in recent years, and it hasn't happened. And part of that's because of how the UK government has operated its budget, but also the challenges it's having managing its budget in year means the focus is very short term rather than longer term and looking at these bigger issues. And I think that's one of the things that is perhaps not a fiscal framework specific thing, but something about the way the overall UK fiscal framework works, in the need for greater planning, greater certainty, and providing that the UK fiscal event timings happen in a way that allows the devolved administrations to plan their budget. And then organisations like ours can then put more pressure on the Scottish Government to deliver multi-year plans, multi-year spending settlements, so that we can actually then see that play out and hold the government to account on what it's doing.
And very briefly, if I may, I would say that I agree that this issue of in-year flexibility is a key challenge for the Scottish Government. And I think the Scottish Government is right and fair when it says, well, actually, let's say public sector pay deals come in more than expected. If that happens with the UK Government, they can always decide, they can say, we're not going to borrow, we're going to find out within limits. They often do that to try to kind of put pressure on negotiations. But they can always say, actually, let's go to the markets and borrow that money to pay for it. The Scottish Government can't do that. If its pay deals are outpacing the UK's, it needs to find that in its budget in year, making cuts. Saying you actually have a bit of a leeway, you can borrow the equivalent of 1 or 2% of your budget in year to address these sorts of issues, I think would be a big improvement. So I think the biggest change I would make would be to have some discretionary resource borrowing subject to some strict limits. I'd also agree with João that this, in my view, farce of saying that VAT assignment is coming down the line needs to be ended. It was repeated again in the Scottish Government's tax strategy that will continue to work with the Treasury on a basis for this. The only way you can really solve this is by actually making companies divide up their accounts into what's Scotland, what's the UK. If that's a plan, say it. If it's not, can it?
Okay. Sure, that's a good question for us to ask a future panel. That concludes our questions for this morning. So thank all three of you for being with us today. It's been very, very interesting, and I think has given us a really good grounding on which to base our future questions to other panels. So thank you very much for that. And order.